this is David Bernstein, founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and this is the Jewish Contrarians podcast. I'm here with my usual partner in thought crime, Brandy Shufutinsky. Hello, Brandy.
Hey, David.
And another Shufutinsky, Dmitri Shufutinsky, who is somebody we've worked with, who's been part of our extended team at the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, an up and coming writer and thinker, and somebody who's recently wrote a book that is prominently stationed on Brandy's bookshelf that I have here too, Jew-Jitsu. Now, Dmitri, this is not a book about martial arts for Jews. Is that correct?
That's correct. I will leave that to other authors to explore in the future. Uh, well, thank you for having me on. No, this book, I decided to name it that because the concept of the martial art Jiu-Jitsu is to use your opponent's power against them. And this book, I lay out a way for Jewish activists or even non-Jewish pro-Israel activists to do just that, particularly with regard to progressive talking points that are usually used to justify anti-Semitism or other anti-Israel kind of invective.
Yeah. Give me an example of that. What's one common anti-Israel refrain that you might hear from somebody on the far left at a campus protest? How are you going to use jujitsu on them? Or would you recommend using jujitsu?
No comment on that one. Yes, so for using jujitsu with something you would see on college campus, my first thought is to go towards the colonialist lie, right? This lie that Israel is an outpost of imperialism in the heart of the Middle East. It's a settler colonial state. The Jews or Israel itself is made up of white European foreign implants taking land from native brown Muslims. And I feel like a lot of the mainstream reaction among some in the Zionist and Jewish activist community has been to try and move away from that argument or not discuss it. And I argue that we actually should lean into this argument about colonialism and indigeneity and play up the historic fact that Jews are the native people of the land of Israel. We have DNA evidence for this. We have archaeological evidence. It's in historic writings that we have been in that land for thousands of years. And to use the colonial argument to discuss who the ancestors of the Palestinian people were. Where did they come from? They came from the Arabian Peninsula during the Arab conquest and conquered not just Israel from the Jews, but the rest of the Levant from the Assyrian and Kurdish peoples. They moved into Persia. They moved into North Africa and settled and colonized land that had belonged to the Berbers, to Black Africans, and even beyond that into Southern Europe. So my argument is to say that instead of shying away from this discussion about colonialism, let's actually use these talking points against them in our favor.
You know, I learned a certain methodology of argumentation and messaging from top marketing and PR people. And they call it sometimes blocking and bridging, or the answer transition message. And it goes like this. Look, there's a few points we want to get across, and we've already, let's say, market tested these points. Like Israel wants peace but has no partner. That's like a meta talking point, right? And that's what you really want to argue, because a lot of people don't think the Palestinian Authority or Hamas are really partners for peace. So if someone presented a colonialist, the argument on colonialism, you would answer, you would say, Israel is not a colonial state. And then you would try to, you don't want to be there. You want to so you want to transition as quickly as possible. Here, the real issue is that Israel's been offering Palestinians land for the last 20 some years, and they've said no, no, and no. They always say no, and they do not accept the state. And here we are now, whatever. So Israel wants peace; it has no partner, and so you're actually going against the grain of that framework of the ATM blocking and bridging framework, and saying, don't block and bridge, meet them where they are and really take them on their own talking points.
Yeah, and I have two reasons for that. One reason is this fundamental idea that you can't have peace that's based on lies. And for a lot of people, their ideas about who's indigenous and who's not is giving them a bias regarding this conflict. And we also have to meet the people who maybe swayed a little bit by just this basic talking point and narrative of the Palestinian side, but don't really know all that much about history. When you present them with the facts and you're also saying, yes, colonialism is the problem, but you're presenting them with the history of it, they can't really argue against that. And if they do, or try to find some kind of way around that, they're just exposing themselves for being a hypocrite or a bigot. But my point here is that also the talking point about partner for peace, we don't have one. We've offered this many times. A lot of the Hasbara that we have tried to get across for the past 25 or 30 years just isn't working anymore, outside of a select small few circles of like-minded people. A lot of the young people nowadays don't know the history, and they'll hear talking points like, okay, maybe the Palestinian Authority is corrupt, or maybe Hamas, is terrible, but Israel can still just kind of unilaterally withdraw or give something else or keep trying. And then we keep getting stuck still reacting to that kind of dialogue. It's not really making any breakthrough. I think if we puncture the holes in these arguments using the fact and using the history, we'll be able to reach more people in a better way.
Mm. Before we go on, I'm going to turn it over to your mother in a moment. But before we do that, um, let's stick with this indigeneity argument. Um, it's not unfamiliar to me, but I will say that I could make an argument that there's no such thing. In other words, nobody. I mean, you can always go back a step further. You could even in our own biblical story before. We had to blow down the walls of Jericho, or so that we could, and there was somebody else living there. There's always somebody before. I mean, of course, it's ridiculous when people make these arguments about indigenous, you know, Native Americans, as if the last tribe that happened to be on that land was somehow indigenous, and the tribe that they had just conquered, 6 months before, wasn't indigenous, and the one before them, and so forth. So, isn't it? Wouldn't it be better to just simply question the whole doctrine of indigeneity?
I mean, that's definitely up for discussion if people wanna question that. But it seems to me that a lot of activists for the Palestinians who have questioned indigeneity do that only when it comes to Israel, only when it comes to the Jewish people. They're giving land proclamations here in the U.S. for the Tongva tribe or whoever it is. But when it comes to Israel, when it comes to the Jews being the native people, they use, oh, well, the Bible says there were Canaanites there before and you came and conquered them. But with other native peoples, that narrative or argument is never used by these same people. So that for me goes back to Natan Sharansky's 3Ds, with the double standards being one of them. So the indigeneity argument is not just to, present the truth that yes, according to history, the Jews are native to the land, but it's also to show the bigotry, the hypocrisy, and the double standard of those who do take that approach of trying to erase the indigeneity of the Jews using this Canaanite example, but will not do the same for other scenarios around the world where that's also been the case.
Andy?
So I take maybe it's a slightly different approach when it comes to the question of indigeneity. I think that there are actual tenets of indigeneity, that it's not about only about what peoples were first on the land. It's about the culture that sprung from the land. So what land did the people belong to? So I think it's important to lean into that discussion, if only for educational purposes, of people actually understanding what the word means. And we see a lot of the ridiculousness that the idea of decolonization and indigeneity have turned, where people are trying to decolonize education and say Scotland, meaning erase Scottish roots in Scotland. But anyway, that's besides the point. Dmitri, what do you think are some of the biggest hurdles to actually carrying out some of the suggestions that you wrote about in your book?
I think that there's a number of them. A lot of the mainstream organizations are too concentrated in their old ways, whether they're not, perhaps they're just not around college campuses or even high schools enough. They haven't set foot in those institutions for many years, so they're not totally aware of what's going on. And there is a communication disconnect between the people in those institutions now and those who have not been there for many years. There's also a lot of focus on the world of social media, on influencers, on conducting activism and Hasbara on those platforms in ways that may be helpful at certain times, but don't really bring it back to the history of the conflict of our people and just really back to basics. And then beyond that, I think also we're still using a lot of the talking points of old, really, that worked in the 80s, that worked in the 90s, maybe even in the early 2000s, but just aren't relevant to this era anymore. And that's something that's even beyond uh, the world of Hasbara. But even if you go wider into looking at how different governments around the world conduct policy in general, it's almost like we're still led by people who act as if we were living in the world of 30 years ago. So there is an element of not having adjusted to the times and not having come up with some kind of creative solutions to the problems that we're dealing with, both generally and also specifically in the case of the world of Hasbara.
Let me ask you, how do you think a younger generation are processing issues around not just settler colonialism, but their larger worldview in a way that might be different than, your mom and I are Gen X, you're Gen Z, right? You're Gen Z.
Millennial.
You're a millennial. Okay. Um, so you don't like the
Sorry,
Gen Z
poor
people. You
kid.
don't like the Gen Z people either.
No.
Okay, right. I didn't think so. But but so, how are your Gen Z underling, how are they viewing the world in a different way that makes it harder for us to use the old arguments?
Well, they're further removed from, for example, the Holocaust, right? The argument that Israel, and President Biden has also made this argument that Israel needs to be there and is justified to exist because of the trauma of the Holocaust. But the Holocaust was, I mean, we're approaching it being nearly a century ago. And so while younger people may certainly read about it in history books and think it was a terrible thing, there's not really a personal connection for most young people, especially those who aren't Jewish, uh, to the Holocaust. And so that's why you've seen more arguments, especially among young people, that why should the Palestinians pay for the sins of Europe? You'll see more of that kind of stuff, where they accept perhaps that the Holocaust may have been a tragedy, but why should another people be forced to pay for it? The other thing that I think young people are maybe have different views on is this notion of capitalism, right? So you'll hear a lot of arguments, especially on venues like TikTok, that capitalism is a destructive system. We had Code Pink arguing that the link between the war in Gaza and the California wildfires is capitalism. And unfortunately, a lot of people in the Hasbara field have been presenting Israel as this high-tech startup nation, very Western, advanced kind of country. And that's actually not very good in the eyes of young people. Does that mean that we should not say that, yes, Israel is a very advanced high-tech society? No, it doesn't. But when they adopt these arguments that Israel is somehow the enemy of the worker, of the proletariat, meanwhile they're moving towards the Palestinian cause as if this is some kind of struggle against capitalism. And I write about this in my book. If you look back to the earliest history of the conflict, it was actually Israel that was much more socialist. There were a lot of Stalinist movements, even within the kibbutz movement, within Israel's left wing Labor Party and other parties in Israel. And you also look at, during that time and certainly now, a lot of the Arab societies were very close with the colonial powers of Europe, Great Britain, France. They were not initially, they did not have the close relationship that eventually they did with the Soviet Union, with oil, with things that harm the environment and allow them to build these vast, grand palaces and skyscrapers with slave labor, essentially. That is like the epicenter of what I would think many young people who are anti-capitalist would imagine as the bourgeoisie that's oppressing them, right? So we have kind of this disconnect between how younger people do think and how they're presented certain elements of propaganda on social media versus how we're presenting Israel's history. And I'm not saying this as somebody who is an anti-capitalist or thinks this way, but we have to understand what the younger generation is thinking in order to present an effective argument to them.
Right. So the jujitsu play on that is that Israel actually has deep socialist roots, and that the Arab world actually was quite colonialist in its orientation.
Yes.
Brandy?
So, I mean, I want to ask you what your opinion is when people start talking about actually the roots of the conflict and about land and about two-state solution and where borders should be, especially with what's happening currently and where, kind of what the argument is. We've heard a lot the past 15, 16 months about how, we need to get a ceasefire so that the Israelis can have peace and security and the Palestinians can have self-determination and land. So it seems like the argument, or is it like it's still being argued that this is a conflict over land. And I'm just curious what you think about that.
This is not a conflict over land, and it never has been. This is another chapter in my book where I talk about the kind of racialist tendencies of the Arab world, that's rooted in their own history of colonialism. So it's not even just with Jews, but anybody that they have conquered and dominated should never have their own independent piece of land or their own equal rights, because that will prove that their ideas of the Arab being at the top of their racial hierarchy is false, that these people are equal to them. And we see this with how Black Africans are treated in Sudan, in Libya, in Tunisia. We see this with how Kurds are still denied their right to exist, not even as their own country, but to have equal rights in a federal Syria or Iraq, to be able to speak their language or hold passports and citizenship in the Assad-dominated Syria that now has fallen. And when it comes to Israel, I mean, Israel has offered, as we talked about in the beginning, has offered to negotiate towards a Palestinian state many times, even before the country was reestablished. And the Arabs said no. This is not about them wanting their own state. It's about not wanting another people they deem to be inferior to be independent. And you have to think about it, because we have, as somebody who's Black, we have this group of scholars and academics and activists who try and claim that there's a relatedness between the Black struggle and the Palestinian struggle. And I think if, at some point in the 1800s, 1700s, we were offered our own independent state, maybe from Louisiana to Florida or something like that, by the government in Washington, D.C., we would have taken it back then. We would have said yes to that. We would have taken our own state, and that would have been the end of it. So there's really no link here. This is not a conflict over land, it's a conflict over racial supremacy.
I mean, with that, would you argue it's colorist? Because I think that this idea that I've heard, arguments I've heard from the kind of anti-Israel side is that, well, brown people are the good guys and on this side, and white people are the bad guys on that side. It just seems like a kind of a colorist supremacist argument.
Well, it sometimes, there can be issues of color and who has darker skin and things like that, but I think it's beyond, the skin color kind of way of thinking about race. This is about identity and tribe. So, you'll have people, not just Jews and Arabs in the land of Israel who pretty much look the same. you'll have the same thing across the region, Berbers and Arabs, Kurds and Arabs, so on and so forth, who look very similar, but their roots are different, their identities are different, their languages are different. That distinguishes them as a separate group. And I think that is behind some of the roots of why we see minorities in the Middle East today treated the way they are, and why the Palestinians still refuse to have their own state and a final peace with Israel.
Who do you think needs to hear this? Are you are you trying to mostly equip younger people with the tools that they need? College students, high school students. Do you think you've made a distinction between the world that your mom and I live in the external environment, and the one that young people live in? Do you think we should stick to the old tools, and you should use the more, you and your age group should use the more jujitsu tools? What do
Wait,
you
David,
think?
did you just call me old?
Well, you
Okay.
are you're younger than me, so I would be that would be a self-indictment, quite a bit younger than me, and also you are in the same generation as me, so you know.
Oh, yeah, I'm old. All right, sorry, go ahead.
I think it's not that we need to stop using all of the older talking points, it's that we need to use them and also use newer or other talking points as well. I personally think that a lot of the old Hasbara does work among some different groups, among some different generations. Um, I also think that there's room for improvement in addition. So to use the arguments in Jiu-Jitsu as well as some of the older ones, rather than just sticking with one or completely cutting that off and moving on to another totally. And I think you have to learn how to be more fluid. So learn how to, who are you talking to? What argument is going to resonate with them more? Instead of kind of this mechanic like way of speaking to everybody that perhaps some organizations engage in. You have to be relatable and tell a story. And that is something that the Palestinian side has, for better or worse, been able to do well, whereas a lot of our side's talking points don't necessarily resonate the same way.
Yeah,
As far as who I wrote the book for, I mean, really, it's for anybody who wants to pick it up. I did have in mind people from, junior, senior, and high school who are getting ready to go to campus, to those already on college campuses, or even, beyond that in graduate school, who feel that they need some of the tools to deal with this. But I also would like a lot of the donors to major mainstream organizations or pro-Israel organizations to take a look at this and to really reflect on what's working and what's not, and just to be open-minded about how do we improve.
great. Brandy, any final questions or thoughts?
Yeah, I just actually had one because I know that you spoke with a group of young men, I think mostly young men at Penn State rather recently. Did anything stand out to you that they asked, or anything that they told you about their experiences on campus?
Well, their campus actually had not had the same level of animosity as some we see in the news. But what I did notice was a lot of them were unaware of how to approach this topic in general. There were some incidents on their campus, and part of the reason they wanted me to speak was because, even though it was a Jewish majority fraternity, a lot of them weren't sure how to approach the topic. And some of these people have been to Israel, or, plan on going soon on birthright, and, are pro-Israel. But I think one of the main issues or causes of things like this, if you'll have pro-Israel Jewish youth who don't know how to handle all of this, is a lot of our mainstream organizations have focused almost exclusively on white supremacist kind of Christian right-wing nationalism, rather than, yes, that needs to be addressed and it exists, but the main cause of the problem on college campuses and elsewhere in this day and age is from the very far left or Islamists. And our mainstream organizations, whether because, maybe they lean to the left politically, or are trying to be politically correct with interfaith efforts with the Muslim community, have not been willing to engage on this topic sufficiently until maybe relatively recently. and our youth have been completely unprepared for dealing with it. So really there needs to be a quick shift in tactics to where we're not just dealing with one stream of anti-Semitism, but we're dealing with all of them.
Yeah. Well, that's our challenge, is to get the Jewish community to take anti-Semitism on the left as seriously as it does on the right. I think that psychologically many have gotten there, but it doesn't mean that they're able to pivot in their actions and in their strategies. They psychologically know it, and yet they're stuck doing some of the same things that they've always done, because to do the hard work of fighting anti-Semitism on the left may mean alienating people on the left that they've long been in partnership with, and they haven't quite crossed the Rubicon there. Dmitri, you've written an important book, one that I highly recommend others read and integrate. And let's see if we can get you in front of more audiences, because I think you have a very important point to make, and you can really help shift the approach. I think you're right. The old arguments aren't working anymore, and we've got to start thinking, bringing in new thinking, new approaches. And I think you've done that here. So great job. And we're going to see a lot of you, I know, in the months and years ahead. So thanks a lot. Thanks for being with us on the Jewish Contrarian podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks, kid.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Take care. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.